from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Terry Griffin will talk about developing profitability maps for crop ground, coupling yield monitor and site-specific crop input data with crop price information to precisely identify the areas of a field which are generating profits and which aren't. Then from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen is back to report on several recent court rulings relevant to you agricultural producers, including a Northeast Kansas farm bankruptcy case involving the divestiture of farmland and how it was priced. Also, with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas, K-State's Gus Vander Hoeven later on, plus more on this Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. We're glad to have you along with us as always, as once again we venture into the area of precision agricultural production and how to best utilize that site-specific crop data. This is a topic we've been wrangling with for quite a while now, and our guest is going to pass along a concept to us that he's really touting for producers to at least think about. And Terry Griffin has joined us once more. He's a precision agricultural economist with K-State Research and Extension. The concept here, Terry, is what you're deeming profitability mapping. Just right to it. What does that refer to?
All of us who've been dealing with yield monitor data have been making maps for a few decades. And rather than having a map of the yield for that field, we can convert that to a map of profitability. So we can get some site-specific information about whether parts of the field are profitable or not. And this is especially important when we're looking at profitability maps over time. One year may be an anomaly, but if we see certain parts of the field that are unprofitable year after year, then we have information with which we can start making some different long-term decisions, especially if our land rental agreements are conducive to do so.
The notion here is to capture that economic variability within a field and then managing it accordingly with, in particular, crop input decisions, right?
That's right. So, I remember the first time I made a profitability map. I was in grad school, my master's program at Arkansas. We were handed a data set, and, first step was to make a yield map. Okay, great. It was really good. Back then, yield maps were sort of novel, and we were really proud of them. And we decided to make it into a profit map. Well, so we multiplied, I think it was rice. I was at Arkansas. Rice yield times price of rice. And would you believe that profit map looked just like the yield map? Because all the inputs were constant. We didn't subtract off anything that was variable. The legend was different, but the map itself was identical. The profitability map was identical to the yield map because essentially it was just a revenue map at that point. So start subtracting off inputs, fertilize costs, seed costs, and so forth. And if all those layers were applied at uniform rates, it won't really be anything exciting. But the exciting part is when we multiply yield times price and subtract off things that did vary across the field, such as fertility from a variable rate fertilizer application. Then it started looking different than the yield map. And then we started to get really into some good questions about site-specific profitability.
Now, as one weaves this together, of course, bringing in that input component, they have to account for not only the rates of input, but the cost of the input. So extra numbers have to be plugged in to make this work, do they not?
They do. And there's some nuances surrounding that. And And we did see some fields that not only we varied the rate of fertilizer across the field, but some parts of the field didn't receive any fertility application, any application of fertilizer. So, in the event that the applicator doesn't have to travel to certain parts of the field, you also don't include the per acre application cost of the applicator itself, not just input. So it can be fairly detailed.
But one of the components that is of essence here, the yield information by way of that yield monitor. And one of the things that you say needs to be accounted for here is the quality of that yield data coming from that monitor.
Yes, the data quality coming from the yield monitor is paramount here. And we've chatted before about using tools that will omit certain observations from the yield monitor when we believe it to be measured erroneously. So we've offered these courses in the past and workshops through CARTA, the Kansas Ag Research and Technology Association, in conjunction with KSRE to have workshops on how to clean yield monitor data. And there's a tool that we've been using since 2004 called Yield Editor from USDA ARS. It's a free download if y'all want to try it out. But we really do need to process that yield data. About a third of yield data points coming from yield monitor were recorded when the yield monitor sensor was not able to make an accurate measurement. The combine dynamics of speeding up, slowing down, potentially even on hillsides. There's some interesting dynamics that happen internally to the machine such that it cannot make an accurate measurement. Well, we need to flag those observations and not include it when we're doing things like nutrient management plans from that data, and also when we're trying to build accurate profitability maps.
Then if one has all the ingredients that would go into the profitability map, and let's presume for the moment that yield data is clean, is of high caliber here, as far as individual crop management, can one simply take that profitability map and make those direct input decisions accordingly with any kind of efficiency here?
So the first question I would ask about that is what is the land rental arrangement? I mean, is this on land that the farmer owns themselves? Is it on land that is crop share rented or cash rented? And the optimal decision may differ, depends on the land arrangement. If it's cash rent, then are we still using the same base acreage for making that calculation? If it's a crop share, it might be a little bit easier to discuss this, given that we're going to not allocate those inputs where they're not going to be productive. And so that would be kind of the first line of questioning that we should ask from a farm management perspective is what kind of land rental arrangement that we're dealing with.
But you've said on previous occasions that perhaps the greatest value from profitability mapping will come in the form of an individual wanting to conduct on-farm research on their premises.
Exactly. Farmers are very inquisitive about how new products, new services, new tillage equipment, or even rates of existing products that they're already using, what's the optimal use of these under their own management, and using these technologies that arrive at a site-specific profitability map, yield monitors and variable rate controllers and automated boom shutoffs, in combination, and the perfect opportunity to conduct on-farm experiments to see how these products and services perform under their management on their environmental regime. What I mean by that is soils and weather and other external factors outside of the farmer's control.
So then, Terry, how does an individual producer get started in creating profitability maps? They have the information. Is there any secret or trick to launching this?
No, it is. There's no secrets or tricks to this. Assuming that we have a properly calibrated yield monitor and yield data were collected and properly cleaned, the equation is fairly simple. It's yields times price of the crop minus the site-specific cost. I find it fascinating that for a while there would be certain offering service providers that were providing this service. But most farm mapping software that farmers are already utilizing, either on their own laptops or through their cooperatives and local service providers, have the ability to do these things. So it's not that difficult to arrive at profitability maps if you've got access to all these data layers. Now that I've said it out loud, a farmer typically has access to yield monitor data, but if they're relying upon third-party service providers to apply variable rate applications, that might be the tougher of the data layers to collect.
So they would need to develop a good working relationship with their providers to make this click, in effect.
Exactly. One of the things I recommend when it comes to variable rate applications from a third-party service provider, and I realize that farmers will agree with this, but the service providers will probably, call the dean to complain. But one of the things I would ask for farmers to consider is part of your agreement with your service providers that you receive not only a map, on paper, but receive the electronic data from the as-applied applications for your records and for ability to create those profit maps.
This is an intriguing topic, and we might mention to folks that on the agmanager.info website, you have posted a link to a recent podcast out of the University of Nebraska, as a matter of fact, addressing this very topic of profitability mapping in detail. You can link to that again at agmanager.info. Interesting idea, Terry, in making the most out of that site-specific cropping data that we talk about so frequently these days on how to optimize its use. Thanks for the input right here on profitability mapping.
Thanks, Eric. It's always a pleasure to be here, and look forward to hearing what our listeners think about this.
Terry Griffin. He's a precision agricultural economist with K-State Research and Extension, and he's been our guest on this opening part of Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
This is Agriculture Today, and next up for you, we have a variety of topics out of the field of agricultural law and taxation to brief you about, as once again with us is Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. Roger, we'll walk right through this list of items that you have in your recent blog on your website. And the first of the several we'll talk about today, a case where a farm couple was unfortunately having to file Chapter 12 bankruptcy. They were looking to liquidate some of their property as assets and ran into some complications. You might explain.
Yeah, this is a Northeast Kansas farm couple, and they filed Chapter 12, which has a very nice tax provision in it. It allows you to deprioritize taxes, both federal and state and local taxes, once you get a discharge in your bankruptcy. But one of the unique things that came up in this case has to do with the trustee's authority to sell farmland. And that is a specific provision in the bankruptcy code. You can sell farmland, you can sell other assets in an attempt to restructure your operation so that you can pay down some of the debt and make it a more manageable operation as you pay off your creditors over a period of time under your reorganization plan. And so that's what they had hoped to do here. And actually, the debtors had 2 contracts involving farmland that they were going to sell. The first contract consisted of 2 parcels totaling 200 acres, and that was prime cropland. The second one was for 120 acres of cropland that was really in bad shape. It needed all types of erosion control structures put on it. It wasn't even eligible to participate in government ag programs in its current condition. The debtors also claimed that they had an oral agreement to lease the purchased properties back to themselves for $175 per acre per year after the sale, as well as a right of first refusal if the buyer were to sell the properties to somebody else so that the debtors could continue to farm the land. But the contracts were silent as to the amount of rent to be paid and whether the right of first refusal applied to all three tracts. And then the debtors proposed to sell the prime ground, the 200 acres, for $4,000 per acre based on a recent sale of another property in the county. But the problem came up when the creditors objected to all this.
Yeah, and you might elaborate on that. The creditors basically thought that the debtors, those that were selling the land or attempting to sell it, were undervaluing that property on the market.
Yeah, the creditors thought the prime land, which was going to be sold for $4,000 per acre, should have gone for at least $5,000 per acre, and that the pasture and the wasteland, that wasn't correctly valued either. But primarily the focus was on that prime ground being significantly undervalued to the tune of $1,000 per acre. So, you take 200 acres and $1,000 per acre, that's $200,000 that the creditors were saying that, you should have, if you're going to sell it, we think you should sell it for at least $2,000 more.
How did the bankruptcy court come down on this when it examined that contention on the part of the creditor then?
Well, the bankruptcy court agreed with the creditors and said that the debtors here had inadequately priced the prime cropland. Now, they said that in terms of the poor condition land, that the second contract didn't undervalue that. But the court said although the sale didn't require satisfaction of outstanding liens, there were significant concerns about some aspects of the proposed sale. Are you going to be able to resume farming? That's going to be dependent upon the lease of the three tracts after the sale for rent that would be less than the debtor's present debt service. And the court said, well, your right to lease would only last as long as the proposed buyer owned the properties. And so they denied the proposed sale primarily due to an inadequate sale price for that prime cropland.
You believe, as you note in your blog write-up, that if the debtor, upon attempting to sell this land, had actually had that land appraised appropriately, that they might have been able to carry the day here with their attempted sale.
Yeah, and I think that's the take-home lesson out of this case. Don't try to do this stuff yourself. Have that cropland in this instance, and have farmland if you want to sell in the context of Chapter 12. Have it exposed to the actual market through a listing. That was clearly a problem in this case because they didn't do that. I think if that had been done, there likely would have been testimony and probably other evidence to support the price in addition to the debtor's testimony. And then you could have an appraiser testify. And I think all of those factors would have helped the debtors in this case, but they didn't do that. And so I think the lesson here is don't try to do this stuff yourself. Follow standard procedures for marketing and selling property in the context of the 12. You got to think about how you're building your case, because your creditors are probably going to object. If they think you're not getting enough for that property that the market would bear, you better have evidence as to the selling price that you actually sold it for is reasonable, or the court is going to deny the trustee's ability to sell that property out of the estate.
And once again, that was a Kansas-based case, a decision by the bankruptcy court, actually rendered in late October. Very fresh development there. Roger, we'll revert back to something that we discussed last time out about your concern over the potential expansion of what's known as the public trust doctrine. And there was a recent court ruling out west that lended more to that conversation. You might explain.
That's right. Last time we talked, I was discussing the doctrine in the context of a Nevada Supreme Court opinion where the court refused to expand it to vested water rights. And now we have the Oregon Supreme Court in a case involving a claim that the public trust doctrine required the state of Oregon to protect various natural resources in the state from harm due to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change and ocean acidification. And again, if people remember last time we talked, that doctrine has historically only applied to submerged and submersible land, kind of the open sea application of the public trust doctrine. And there's been this attempt in recent years to try to expand that doctrine to such things as vested water rights, mineral rights, including oil and gas, wild animals in the state, endangered species that might be on private property in a state. And so far the courts have said no, that the doctrine does not apply to that. And if that wall ever cracks, if we had a court that would rule otherwise, that means that the public trust doctrine would be deemed to have existed prior to any individual's private property rights, and therefore there are no private property rights that are thus being taken by the government because the public trust doctrine predates those. So it's an end run around the government's requirement to pay for private property that they take under the Fifth Amendment. That's really the thorny thing that's out there about this that we have to continue to watch.
That the agricultural community needs to remain vigilant on how this public trust doctrine continues to be interpreted.
Yeah, it's not a front burner issue. I mean, it's not talked about in the media. We don't see this every day, but this is brewing in the courts brought by certain groups and I would say legal academics that are pushing this theory. And it's kind of behind the scenes. Yeah. But from a policy standpoint and its application to landowners, farmers, and ranchers, it could be quite pernicious. And we just have to be aware of these things.
All right. The last item we'll tackle today, this is concerning a zoning ordinance and whether or not an individual was allowed to retain and maintain farm animals in an area which was zoned for residential purposes. What were the details?
Yeah, this is an issue that comes up quite a bit, Eric. In a lot of small rural towns have ordinances saying the types of animals that are permissible on your property that's deemed to be residential property. Maybe you've got a large lot or a couple of lots on a corner in a town, and it's in the rural area, so, it's not Topeka, Wichita, Kansas City, or a large city like that. So somebody might have chickens, they might have goats, those are fairly common, might have a donkey. And kind of this rural urban fringe areas, you get into these issues. And so we had a recent case out of Pennsylvania, and you've got an individual that's got a 2-acre property. It's residentially zoned, and she keeps, on this 2 acres, now keep in mind, 50 animals on the property, including goats, donkeys, and chickens. Well, 50 animals on 2 acres in a residentially zoned area is likely to create issues, particularly on the nuisance side of things. And that was the zoning, and there was also a city ordinance that says you can't keep goats, donkeys, and other farm animals on a residentially zoned property. And so the city comes after her and says, you can't have these animals here. And she appealed the cease and desist letter that she got to the zoning hearing board. And she admitted, yeah, most of my property is in a residentially zoned area, but I do have a sliver of it that is actually in an ag area. So I should be okay. But
the trial court didn't buy that argument?
No, not at all. The trial court said, no, and we're not going to deal with your evidentiary arguments that you made either, and the fact that somebody else came in with a letter from another property that said, well, I have animals in the county, and the city hasn't done anything with me. And the court said, no, that's just one instance. I mean, you've got 50 animals on your 2-acre tract. The other party had a chicken. That's a little bit different than the zoo that you're keeping on your property. So the appellate court said didn't have enough evidence to establish uneven enforcement or that the ordinance was unconstitutional as applied to you. So a common issue, we do see it come up quite a bit.
Well, the cases we've discussed today are very representative of the kind of information, folks, that you can see regularly on Roger's blog. It's at washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. And Roger, thanks as always. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric.
He's a professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. He is Roger McEowen, and we'll be back with more on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Next up, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, that November USDA World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimate report released yesterday was expected to be a bullish report, but it exceeded those expectations. Yield and production on both corn and soybeans fell greater than expected. 2.6 bushels per acre for corn, 1 bushel for soybeans. Ending stocks fell by 465 million bushels for corn and 100 million bushels for beans. Perhaps the biggest surprise, the 325 million bushel rise in U.S. corn exports. Here's USDA Chief Economist Cindy Nickerson.
The estimate for corn exports was revised upwards by 325 million bushels. That's largely due to demand in China. And what we're expecting with corn, U.S. corn supply and demand, the average market price is now estimated at $4 per bushel, which is up 40 cents from October's estimate.
Cindy Nickerson of the USDA. On the world front, while Brazil and Argentine corn production for 2021 was left largely unchanged, the dramatic supply and demand changes sent world-ending stocks of corn to 11.5 billion bushels, down from 11.8 billion in October. If that comes to fruition, global ending stocks will be nearly 1.1 billion bushels below those of 2018 and 19. Perhaps the largest surprise of all in the report, no hike in U.S. soybean exports. The current export pace a record large, 1.78 billion bushels. That totals 81% of the entire year's projection. With China buying U.S. soybeans already at 1.17 billion bushels and internal prices in China reaching $16 per bushel, it's likely that China may not yet be done buying ahead of Brazil's new harvest. On the world front, soybean production declined by 220 million bushels, the U.S. responsible for 98 million bushels of that drop, while Brazil production was left unchanged. Argentine soybean production lowered to just 1.8 billion bushels. World-ending stocks of beans falling from October to just 3.18 billion, and soybean meal ending stocks to 8.9 million short tons, down from 9.6 million. The average price for soy meal by the USDA raised by $20 per ton to $355. The average soybean oil price was increased by 2 cents per pound to $34.50. And on the wheat side of the report, notably in the global wheat picture, a drop in Argentine wheat production, 661 million bushels. That would be the lowest level in 8 years. Russian wheat rose by 3 billion bushels plus, and world consumption of wheat was increased due to a feed and residual increase for China and the EU. China's wheat imports are the largest since 1995 and 96. While world-ending stocks, according to the USDA, fell modestly to 11.7 billion bushels, that would still be record large. Closer to home, the Kansas crop production numbers out of yesterday's report read like these. Based on the November 1st conditions, the 2020 corn crop in the state forecast at 759 million bushels, down 5% from last year's production, and the acreage harvested at 5.75 million. That's down 4% from a year ago. The corn yield in Kansas, 132 bushels per acre, down a bushel from last year. Grain sorghum forecast at 237 million bushels. That's up 16% from last year, with harvested acreage at 2.7 million acres, up 15% from 2019. And the yield for grain sorghum forecast at 86 bushels per acre, up a bushel from last year. Soybean production forecast at 200 million bushels in the state. That's up 7% from last year, with harvested acres at 4.75 million, up 6% from 2019. And the soybean yield in Kansas forecast at 42 bushels per acre, up a half a bushel from last year. Lastly, in the state, cotton production is forecast at 328,000 bales, up 14% from last year, with harvested acreage at 195,000, up 44,000 from 2019. That would be a record high cotton acreage in the state if it's realized, with the yield forecast at 788 pounds per acre, down 102 pounds per acre from a year ago, according to the USDA. And House Agriculture Committee Chairman Colin Peterson, who was defeated in his bid for another term in office, is reported now to have thrown his support behind Representative David Scott of Georgia to be the next leader of that committee. He notes that the two haven't always agreed on every issue, but Peterson said they have been able to work together in the past to find a path forward on issues over the years. Peterson said that he followed Representative Kika de la Garza, the first Hispanic panel leader, when he came in, and he says it would be another important milestone to have the first black chair on the committee. Ranchland Trust of Kansas recently was awarded 3 grants for a conservation project. Scarlett Higgins tells us here that project will focus on the western part of the state.
Ranchland Trust of Kansas was awarded $100,000 from the Playa Lakes Joint Ventures ConocoPhillips Capacity Grant Program to support the launch of a 4-year education and conservation project in western Kansas. RTK also received 2 additional grants to go toward the project, including one from the North American Wetlands Conservation Act and one from the Natural Resources Conservation Service through the Conservation Collaboration Grants or Agreements Program. Partners in the Kansas Prairie Wetlands NACA grant proposal are organizations dedicated to conserving and protecting wildlife and water. Many are city and county entities or corporations that are concerned about Kansas and their communities. The Conservation Collaboration Grants or Agreements Program allows NRCS to leverage funding with private partner resources to increase the overall success in achieving mutual goals of protecting and conserving agricultural lands. Landowners in western Kansas now will have the option to enhance, increase, and protect grassland habitats through the Ranchland Trust of Kansas project with conservation easements. RTK's role will be to build new relationships with ranchers to initiate dialogue between landowners and conservation partners. I'm Scarlett Higgins.
And hog producers were getting closer to that virtual K-State Swine Day. It is set for next week, Wednesday the 18th and Thursday the 19th. They focus the first morning on applied swine nutrition and the second morning on feed safety and feed processing. You still have plenty of time to register, and to do so or to find out more about the particulars of the program, go to ksuswine.org. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
The occupants move on. They have to. It's the rule of the land.
That's Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Many years ago, I visited the White House and took the tour. It is an impressive building, but in my eyes, more so what it stands for than a beautiful structure. It's no cathedral. It's no temple. It's no museum, although historical artifacts are kept and cared for. It's called the White House, and it is lived in with private quarters in which whomever occupies the White House can withdraw with his or her family. It is the White House. Outside there are gardens. There is the so-called Rose Garden, and I love those trees which have history behind them. As the trees grow, the occupants and their children left or died as old folks. Some not so old. To live in the White House is not always easy. Yes, it is the White House. The White House has its extensive staff who look after the house, cleaning, repairing, and maintaining. Most stay with the house as the occupants change after 4 or 8 years of occupancy. The occupants move on. They have to. It's the rule of the land. It comes with living in the White House. As with all houses, the White House has a kitchen, a large kitchen which has a staff to prepare elaborate meals as well as simple but tasty hamburgers if wanted. One has to eat. While I have been thinking about the White House these last few days, I came across a small booklet. It popped out of the bookcase as I pulled out another book. The little booklet has only 24 pages and is titled Sod House Pioneers by Bill James. A friend sent it to me in July '81. I glued her letter in front of it. It's mailed from Jetmore, Kansas. Jetmore is north of Dodge City and east from Horse Thief Reservoir. The little book is fascinating as it describes the sod houses built by the early settlers where few building materials were available and where cow chips were used as fuel to heat the stove or fire on which to cook food. There are clear black and white photographs of the simplest of structures, some mere holes in the ground, to more elaborate structures, built up of carefully laid up sod with a roof made of poles and planks over which tar paper was placed with the top on it of tightly laid sod. I'm looking at the photo of a sod dugout home in Ford County. The family stands in front, at least 3 generations. The photo was taken in 1906. Other photos show a dugout in Cheyenne County, dated 1890. There's a photo of a family at milking time. Family and cows are photographed in front of a large sod house, squarely built with smooth roof, windows, and a door. A tall windmill stands close. It's their house. What struck me is this. Here, these last few days, my thoughts have been with the White House. A home for a family with a lot of splendor, flags and trumpeting. And in western Kansas, 130 more years ago, while the White House already stood on its foundation and was occupied, were people who settled down and built their own earthen structures, the sod house. The simple structures were primitive, yet they were a home to people who settled the land and one way or another started to farm, grow crops to feed themselves and maybe sell if there was a surplus, if storms or insects had not ravaged their crops or fire had destroyed it. Just think about the extremes. The White House, the sod house. Strong people building farms and ranches to grow food. Food we all need to survive. Here's a poem. The men behind the plow. They sing about the glory of the man behind the gun, and the books are full of stories of the wonders he has done. There's something sort of thrilling in the flag that's waving high, and it makes you want to holler when the boys go marching by. But when the shouting's over and the fighting's done, somehow we find we're still depending on the man behind the plow. In the pomp and splendor of an army on parade, and through all the awful darkness that the smoke of battle made, in the halls where jewels glitter and where shouting men debate, in the places where rulers deal out honors to the great, there's not a single person who'd be doing business now or have medals if it wasn't for the man behind the plow. We're building mighty cities and we're gaining lofty rights. We're winning lots of glory and we're setting things to rights. We're showing all creation how the world affairs should run. Future men will gaze in wonder at the things we have done. And we overlook the feller, just the same as we do now, who's the whole concern's foundation, the man behind the plow. S.E. Kaiser.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. Well, our time is away for today, but before we sign off, this, of course, is Veterans Day, honoring all those who have served our country nobly and selflessly, and with so many that have made the ultimate sacrifice. We can never fully repay our debt to our veterans, but at the very least, please join us here at the network in taking this occasion to salute our heroes. Do reach out and thank a vet today. On tomorrow's broadcast, we'll welcome in from the IGP Institute here at K-State, grain market economist Guy Allen. He'll dig into that USDA World Grain Supply and Demand Report, which was released yesterday, which sported some really friendly numbers for the grain trades. We'll visit with Guy about the longer-term implications of those numbers, along with much more right here tomorrow. Please be back with us then, won't you? Meantime, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.